Please welcome our second panel to the stage, Patrícia Campos Mello, Irene Khan, Joel Simon, and Jan Jiginsu. This session will be moderated by Carolina Henriquez-Schmitz.
Hello, welcome everyone. As you heard, my name is Carolina Henriquez-Schmitz. I'm the director of Trust Law, the global legal pro bono program of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. As you heard from Antonio earlier today, at the Foundation, we are deeply committed to advancing media freedom through news, media development, free legal assistance, and convening initiatives. We're combining our services to create an enabling environment in which media can operate independently, freely, and safely, while also advancing and promoting best business practices, and especially with respect to independent media in countries at risk. It goes without saying, and you've heard a number of other speakers say it earlier, but it bears repeating. There is a war on press freedom. In recent years, attacks on journalists have surged, and legal threats, legal action targeting journalists and news outlets has been increasingly used and threatened to silence critical voices. From fake news, misinformation, disinformation laws, to national security laws, even tax and fraud laws. There are new laws and new ways in which laws are being weaponized to curtail press freedom. The impact of these cases, both the legal cost, potentially resulting damages from these cases, threaten to bankrupt journalists and media outlets around the globe. And in the current landscape, often journalists are facing these legal threats alone, without the backing of well-resourced media houses or the financial ability to hire a good lawyer or multiple lawyers, which is what they currently need. All of this with the backdrop of also the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbating the situation further and further silencing voices. And this has had an impact that's nothing short of devastating for media freedom. Legal threats and action against journalists is not only crippling for the media, but for our democracies. Instead of being able to hold power to account, which is fundamental in democratic societies, journalists are instead facing exorbitant fees and claims for damages. They're facing criminal convictions and even prison, simply for doing their public interest work. So today we want to shine a light on these threats, on the legal challenges journalists are facing, the new and frankly terrifying ways in which laws are being used to silence journalists. We'll also talk about some positive developments and opportunities for collaboration that are emerging to counter these threats. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panel. In the order seating from me, we have Jan Jiginsu, who is the Deputy Chair of the High-Level Panel of Legal Experts on Media Freedom, the independent advisory arm of the Media Freedom Coalition. Next to him, we have Joel Simon, the fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University and a senior visiting fellow at the Knight First Amendment Institute. Next to him, Irene Khan is the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and Expression, and the first woman to have been appointed to that post. And Patrícia Campos Mello is a reporter at large at Folha de Sao Paulo newspaper and an associate research scholar at Columbia University. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's jump right in. Joel, I'll start with you. So at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we've been working with you in Columbia University to do some research into emerging legal trends in media freedom at a global scale. And as part of that work, you've been mapping the legal threats, in particular, the journalists are facing. Can you share a bit about what you found? What are the highlights?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So up until the end of last year, I ran the Committee to Protect Journalists, and what we saw there in my time was that legal threats against journalists were mounting, and governments were becoming more and more sophisticated about how they use the law to attack press freedom and curtail the work of journalists. So this year at Columbia University, the research I'm doing, part of the research is on these legal threats and classifying and categorizing them, and we've brought in a team to help do this. We've hired a researcher, and we've been consulting with legal experts around the world to help us understand what the threats are and what are the most serious. So preliminarily, what I can say is we found 14 categories of legal threats. They break down broadly into defamation, seditious libel, those kinds of attacks. Slaps, which has already been mentioned, is a growing legal threat to journalists around the world. We've also looked at national security laws. We've looked at laws around public security. We looked at laws around fake news and disinformation, which is increasingly being weaponized as well. And then there were also trumped-up charges against journalists for things like tax evasion or other things not related directly to their work. And in our initial consultation with experts, what we found is there is significant and growing concern about the ways that governments are using, particularly defamation laws and seditious libel, and also slaps. Slaps are a growing concern for journalists and media organizations around the world. Cyber libel, which is basically a sort of subcategory of defamation targeting information that's published online, and then also fake news and laws against fake news and disinformation. So this is what our initial research shows, but I think most broadly what it reveals is there's an entire arsenal of repressive laws that could be weaponized. They're not inherently repressive, but they can be used to achieve repressive purposes, and this is, as you, I think, described it very accurately, I would say perhaps the most fundamental threat to press freedom and journalists around the world.
Thank you, Joel. And I know that during we were talking about the research previously, you mentioned something like 14 or 15 potential legal threats identified, which is...
14 separate categories of legal action. And we'll have more to say on this as we carry out the next phase of our research, but those are our initial findings.
That gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. John, in your experience as a practitioner and in your work with high-level panel, how does what Joel just described align with your experience? What are the newer, perhaps more perverse ways in which the law is being weaponized?
Well, I'd say, I mean, from my perspective, on the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, I'd echo Joel's findings. We're also working closely together to really concretize these categories. But I just want to put my practitioner hat on for a moment and refer to two sets of cases in relation to two sets of countries. Some of you will know that I, along with Keelan Gallagher, Amal Clooney, and Claire Overman, act for Maria Ressa, a Nobel Peace Laureate, one from whom we heard last year at this conference. You look at the cases being waged against Maria Ressa and her platform Rappler, and put aside for a moment the cyber libel case, which is relatively easy to explain and take apart. You see that the majority of the existing cases against her are actually cases linked to foreign ownership allegations, tax investigations. One of the allegations is that Rappler is a dealer in securities. So you get a sense of the way in which the law is being used for collateral purposes to really put pressure on independent journalism in a place such as the Philippines. Now, move across to Maria's co-joint honoree from whom you heard today, Dmitry Muratov, and the way in which the foreign agent laws in Russia were promulgated, used against human rights defenders in the first instance, and then extended and used against media outlets, culminating, of course, in the recent closure of Novaya Gazeta. And those laws, of course, are before the European Court of Human Rights in the case brought by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties. So courts, international bodies are now having to grapple with what I say are the collateral uses of regulatory chill on journalists. And the reason I think states are pursuing this strategy is because investigations around tax, foreign ownership allegations, foreign agent laws, these are fairly complex areas. They turn on the application of overbroad laws, but they're there to obfuscate, raise suspicion, cast doubt on the integrity of the individuals that are being targeted. And I think it's a relatively new state strategy that we're seeing. Just by way of final point, in terms of the high-level panel's work, seeing a lot of, increasingly in states, a lot of the use of a state's right to regulate in this space. So this is pulling accreditation of individual journalists, it's cancelling broadcast licenses, and so on and so forth. And these sorts of moves don't traditionally receive the same attention as slaps or defamation or some of the more sort of direct attacks. And in terms of the work that Joel is doing, in terms of the work that Irene and others are doing, I think it's really important to focus on these new brands of attacks against independent journalism.
Thank you, John. That's a really important point, and it's drawing on lawyers in a way, or requiring lawyers to be engaged in a very different way than traditionally you might imagine lawyers in media law defending media stakeholders. Patrícia, you have a very unique perspective on this as a journalist yourself who has faced and is defending against some of these legal threats. Could you share with us a little bit about the threats that you're specifically facing, that your colleagues are facing, and the impact it's having on your life and on your and other journalists' roles as watchdogs?
Sure. I think in Brazil, as in other democratic countries that are undergoing an erosion of democracy, there is a weaponization of law against journalists. I personally, and many other journalists in Brazil, we're being sued like systematically, and usually it's by businessmen close to the government, not the government itself. So they try to do the slap thing, but indirectly. So one particular businessman, he's suing over 35 journalists in Brazil, and always demanding high, like really high sums, such as, for me, he's suing me, demanding 2 million reais, which is more money than I've ever seen in my whole life. So it has a very, I mean, I am not a freelance, I am a staff reporter at one of the main newspapers, so I have legal assistance. But if I lose my job, I don't have legal assistance. And then the other thing that is really concerning, and that also in democratic countries or illiberal democracies, is the way governments are sort of capturing the judiciary. For instance, in Brazil, President Bolsonaro, who runs for re-election, the second round is on Sunday, he's already said that one of the first things he's going to do is try to get, and he has the support of Congress to do that, increase the number of justices in the Supreme Court. That means that the last of the checks and balances standing is going to fall, and we all the journalists, and also my colleague who was here before for the Kurt Schork Awards, Rafael, we all trust the Supreme Court, you know, to apply the law and to read the Constitution, but we're no longer going to have the Supreme Court. So things like I'm being sued for stories I did using our Freedom of Information Act. This is unheard of. As of now, I'm okay because I know the Supreme Court is going to dismiss that, but if we have a further capture of the judiciary, this is going to change.
That is, you've highlighted an important point, the role of the judiciary. And in a lot of ways, this war on press freedom is being fought in courts. And so they're an important bastion in that defense of media freedom. And I think that perhaps more attention, this has been, been raised by a number of different players, including UNESCO, who has a strong focus on ensuring that the judiciary is sufficiently trained and adequately understands what media freedom principles are and how to protect journalists, both against attacks, but also how to preserve the institutions, key democratic institutions. So it's a very important point. Thank you for raising it. Irene, gender is a really important aspect of your mandate. It'd be interesting to hear from you, how do you see gender playing into the use of these legal threats against journalists?
Well, gender equality is an integral component in the concept of diverse, independent, free, pluralistic media. Mm-hmm. And what we see here, I'm going to in a minute talk about the larger issue of digital threats. But while on the one hand, digitalization has expanded the access of media and made journalism easier in many ways, one of the areas that has opened up, unfortunately, a threat that has opened up, is attacks on women journalists, online attack on women journalists. And these tend to be highly sexualized, well-coordinated, and vicious, absolutely vicious. Yesterday, I was at the BBC speaking to women journalists in the BBC Persian service who have been attacked online by Iranian agents and unable to find any adequate legal remedy because the attacks are coming from across the border. So digitalization has actually created opportunities to communicate, but also to threaten across borders. Mm-hmm. We have seen in the case of Maria Ressa and also Carol Kaledover, who was involved in the exposure of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. In those cases, on the one hand, they were targeted with slaps, and on the other hand, there were very well-coordinated attacks online, basically in a way to wear them out, to attack and create so much mental distress on the individuals. I've heard Carol talking about it, and she was in tears. In a public event, she still found it very difficult to cope with the kind of attacks that take place. And the risk is that many of these online attacks translate into offline action. The Persian BBC Persian service journalists were talking about how those online attacks, when they are in the field, one journalist was on the field on the border of Iraq and was almost manhandled, physically attacked, and security guards to come in to protect her because of all the attack and smear campaigns that had gone on online. So it's making it extremely difficult for women who are badly needed, because when women's voices are not heard as journalists, then society is missing a very important perspective on news and views.
Mm-hmm. Let's discuss this further, the digital space.
Yes.
You wrote, as part of the 10th anniversary for the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists, you wrote a report to the UN Human Rights Council about the opportunities, challenges of press freedom in the digital age. And we, as you just highlighted, there are a number of ways in which it's advanced, arguably, media freedom, and at the same time posed some serious threats, both in terms of the use and the availability, access to attacks, but also the ways in which regulation of that space is then threatening press freedom. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, as earlier, as Jan was talking, sedition, and Joel, laws on sedition and counterterrorism are being used to censor journalists, to criminalize journalism. But we see sometimes, of course, they're being applied in the online space. And in the online space, the punishments tend to be much harsher, because governments are trying to stop the amplification of news. So we see, for example, the Digital Security Act of Bangladesh has much higher punishment for online media than traditional legacy media. So there's these old systems that are being made harsher through the digitalization of news. But I've mentioned to you about the online violence against women, but then this cross-border attack. Cross-border, there's a legal gap there. My human rights as a citizen of this country is being violated by another government. I am without remedy. How do I bring that government to the national courts? There is a House of Lords decision going back to the time of the Iraq war, which actually excluded extraterritorial application of human rights. The court at that time was looking at the behavior of British soldiers in Iraq, but now I think that decision is coming to bite UK citizens in a different sort of way. So I think there's a huge gap there that needs to be handled. I think there is also the issue of surveillance. There is electronic surveillance. We've all heard about the Pegasus project and so on. And there are some countries, in Germany, for example, where the law on electronic surveillance for counterterrorism does not exclude journalists. So they could be under electronic surveillance. And that, of course, is dangerous for them, but also dangerous for their sources. There is also a third issue here about privacy laws. Privacy laws are now being weaponized against journalists. Let me give you one example of the Swiss banking secrecy law, under which a whistleblower can go to prison for up to 3 to 5 years for exposing banking information, banking details, even though those details may have been made in good faith to expose a crime, a financial crime. A journalist who publishes the information from the whistleblower is also subject to the same punishment. And in fact, I'm now going from here to Bern to raise this issue with the Swiss government. One German journalist I wanted to speak to refuses to cross the border to come into Switzerland because he's afraid that he'll be arrested on arrival because he has written in Süddeutsche the story of Credit Suisse and the financial mismanagement there. And this is happening in the heart of Europe. So I think it's very worrying, the different ways in which laws are being weaponized and reinforced to attack journalists because of the digitalization space.
It's a minefield. It doesn't seem, at any turn, it feels like any law can be used against you. John, as we're talking about regulation of the online space, and in particular social media, we've seen a surgence of disinformation laws, and including the new Turkish disinformation law. It might be helpful to use it as an example of what are the dangers of that kind of law and how far-reaching they can be.
Of course, I mean, just picking up on what Irene has said, quite a lot of these misinformation or disinformation laws do actually have exterritorial application. That's supposed to be rare when you're legislating domestically, not so rare in this area, giving rise to a number of legal questions as to whether other states have positive obligations to protect their own citizens that may be subject to such laws. So far as what has happened since the COVID pandemic and the enactment and proliferation of new laws, of course, there have always been disinformation, misinformation laws. There's a real history. I think certain countries go back almost a century. The reason that we're talking about this more and more is really the discussion that began with the pandemic and some of the new legislation that was very hastily enacted following the pandemic. Obviously, from a policy perspective, you can understand why a government may want to regulate the spread of false information if it relates to public health concerns. There were initial concerns about false news around vaccines, etc. The problem, of course, is that it's led dozens of countries now to use that as a pretext to enact very vaguely worded, overbroad legislation, where the fear is that legislation is going to be deployed for collateral purposes. And you raised the example of Turkey. The Venice Commission's already looked at this law. It was enacted, I think, formally last week. The fact that it's been enacted months before arguably the most important election in Turkish Republican history is obviously cause for real concern. But the Turkish example has to be seen in the broader context. I mean, there are laws out there in relation to other countries where the penalty stretched to life imprisonment. And of course, if you are operating in a country where there's a real concern around judicial independence, such that no amount of UNESCO training is going to mitigate the risk of what we sometimes call telephone justice, when the executive picks up the telephone to the judge or the panel of judges, then you see the governments being judge and jury in these cases and setting out what the truth is. That's obviously extremely dangerous, and it's going to put an enormous amount of pressure on the international bodies that review national courts, whether it's at the Council of Europe level, the Inter-American level, or at the UN level.
Patrícia. Oh, go ahead, Irene, I see you.
No, what I wanted to say is that, we're talking, of course, about legal trends and legal threats to journalists. But we should not forget the one deadly statistic, that 9 out of 10 cases of killings of journalists are not investigated and prosecuted. Now, if that is the state of the world, and this figure the statistic hasn't moved, the needle hasn't moved for decades, despite all efforts. If the state is not willing to investigate killings of journalists, if that's the situation, then how can state institutions protect journalists? So whether it is the judiciary, whether it's the prosecution system, whether it's parliament, there seems to be there a devaluation of media freedom. And media freedom is a pillar of democracy. It's a public service, it's a fundamental human right. I think we need to see it that way. Otherwise, we will constantly see this sort of undermining of other institutions that help to prop up media freedom, like the judiciary.
Such an important point on the role of states. Jill, were you wanting to come in there?
No, I think the point I want to make is that, you know, we are seeing the legal threats rise. We're seeing more and more journalists imprisoned. We've seen long-term trends. And what's been incredibly disturbing is the way that governments have weaponized efforts to kind of create, you could call it a healthy information space that are often, done in ways that are ill-intentioned. And this is the kind of opportunism I've seen for decades. You know, in the war on terror, where you had that framing, governments opportunistically cast their repressive action as essential to protect national security. When President Trump in the United States started talking about fake news, we saw governments around the world criminalize the publication of fake news in a very opportunistic way. During the pandemic, as John mentioned, we saw governments opportunistically exploit concerns about public health and misinformation about vaccines to crack down on fundamental rights and censor the media. Now we're seeing governments using this opportunity around disinformation. You mentioned the Turkish law. So this just points to the complexity and the challenge of trying to push back against these legal threats, and it also suggests that the power that governments increasingly have in the information space. We're talking about this kind of lawfare strategy, but on the previous panel, when we heard from the Kurt Schurk awardees, they talked about another strategy, this kind of censorship through noise or strategies of mass distraction, sometimes it's called, just the challenge that journalists face reaching the public in an environment where governments are corrupting and undermining the information space. And then the third strategy that governments are using is the one that Irene just mentioned, which is these campaigns of harassment, as Patrícia can attest, don't just spontaneously happen. They're triggered and coordinated by governments, often by leaders in government. In the case of Brazil, Bolsonaro has the ability to trigger his followers. We saw this with Trump in the United States. There are many, many other examples. So the fundamental challenge here is pushing back against the rising power and influence that governments have in the information space and the way in which they are using it to corrupt and undermine informed public debate.
Mm-hmm. Can I say something, just from the point of view of reporters? The way it is now is we spend half our time talking to lawyers, about legal harassment cases that we know are not going to advance, but we still have to spend time, and we still need legal assistance. And you're always anxious because you don't know if the judge who's going to rule on it is a judge who's friendly to the government or not. And then the other half, we are being attacked online. And when I mean being attacked online, is just, it becomes really overwhelming for you to work when you have, for instance, the president of a country making jokes, saying that, you offer sex in exchange for information, and then you have all kinds of, porn montages, which is what happened with me, and porn videos, and also, supported and even stimulated by governments. So instead of dedicating all our time to reporting, investigating, we are just spending our time talking to lawyers or having to, have a bodyguard because they're threatening your son, or then just waking up to a new porn picture with you on it, and this is not how it's supposed to be, right?
And it highlights such an important point around the mental health crisis that, I think as a society we're experiencing, and certainly reporters who are having to face these kinds of threats online, offline, in courts.
Can I come back to the point that Joel made about the power of governments, unbridled power now to attack and undermine media? I would like to put it in other terms. There is an obligation of governments under international law, under international human rights obligations that governments have willingly accepted. They have an obligation to protect media freedom, independent, free media, and they are consistently failing. So this raises a question of accountability, international accountability. And you mentioned the UN Plan of Action. Of course, it is about what the UN can do, but I would like to put some pressure on the member states. And I have recommended that there be a multi-stakeholder forum developed that would allow civil society, media companies, social media companies, and member states to sit around the table under the auspices of the UN and to discuss these problems, so that governments don't get away with ignoring their responsibility to protect journalists as part of the human right to freedom of opinion and expression.
Obviously echoing everything that Irene says, I want to just add an additional dimension, or at least make it express. So we have bad actors and we have good actors, so far as states are concerned. And the whole point of the Media Freedom Coalition was supposed to be that it's good actors coming together and doing things to dissuade bad actors. I do think that we need to spend some time also, and it's part of what we do on the high-level panel, thinking about what the positive obligations are on the good actors qua bad state action. And that's not just a policy discussion, that's a legal discussion, whether it's by reference to obligations under the ICCPR or a regional human rights mechanism. I mean, Irene's point, which is a critical one, around the failure to investigate and the fact that that statistic has not shifted in years. Patricia's point about, the way in which harassment begins today. A good actor can no longer constrain itself as a state to just making statements about individual cases. They need to propagate real mechanisms, both to disincentivize the bad actors, so sticks, but also carrots. And those carrots may be economic. One has to think outside of the box now. It is so bad that it is no longer enough for a coalition of states to come together and to express concern in relation to an individual case or an individual country. We need to move from words into deeds.
Hear, hear. And I think it's an important reflection, given that not all cases garner that level of international attention. And so we really need to be putting in place the mechanisms that are going to help all journalists defend against these threats. We're almost at time, and I want to make sure we give a chance for audience to share some questions. So I'll move on to our questions from the audience. The first one is, there seems to be a fragmented response to legal threats to news providers, CPJ, RSF, PFDF, etc. Is there a role for coordination into one umbrella initiative, or is having many players trying more effective?
Well, I mean, I can answer that. I obviously don't speak for CPJ in my current capacity. Look, I think there definitely is a need for coordination, and it's something that we've actually been working on, in my time at CPJ, and also more recently with the creation of a new kind of coordinating mechanism called NJAR, which is a kind of network that's intended to coordinate the kind of response to these legal threats and ensure that journalists have more coordinated support. I think it is actually very important and powerful that there are different organizations with their different areas of specialization, different focus, different resources, different kinds of local knowledge in the space, but obviously more coordination is essential. But I want to just also pick up on something both Irene and Patrícia said. First of all, look, obviously we all want states to meet their human rights obligations, but your point about the challenges in making headway around in the battle against impunity illustrates that this is a very long-term and difficult challenge to influence state behavior, particularly in the current environment. On the other hand, we hear Patrícia talking about the amount of time and energy she spends just dealing with the legal threats against her, and I'm afraid that this is typical for journalists around the world who are doing accountability, investigative journalism. And I think, going back to the original question, this is why we need to strengthen on-the-ground support for journalists who are facing these kinds of legal threats, not just strategic litigation and international litigation, which obviously has a critical role in shaping global standards and building up international jurisprudence, but also on the nuts and bolts legal defense that journalists need in their own countries, which often involves very specialized local knowledge and the ability to fight back against what John referred to as telephone justice, which is a reality in many countries around the world. And so lawyers in these countries know how to mount a legal defense that's both in the courtroom, but recognizes the reality that these cases are often political, and you need political strategies in order to serve the best interests of your clients.
Thank you, Joel. It's certainly assistance, a concrete legal assistance, making it more accessible, more affordable, better known for journalists, I'm sure, is a key priority. In fact, Patrícia, would you mind coming in on that point? What has been your experience and that of your colleagues in terms of access and knowledge of existence of legal support? Is there enough? Is there enough knowledge?
I think sometimes, as Joel said, there's a need for local lawyers because they're very specific. They know how to navigate the courts and, all the political implications. Unfortunately, that's a big factor in many countries. And I don't think people are aware of opportunities to get legal assistance from international organizations. For instance, I know I have several colleagues, several friends who are now freelancing, and they are not doing the investigative work they used to do because they don't have legal assistance. So why would they do that, right? And that happens, unless you have an employer who provides you with the legal assistance, you're no longer going to do the investigative. Even that I have legal assistance, sometimes I pause before publishing or before going deeper because I know the implications. So maybe if more journalists were aware of opportunities of legal assistance, and if the international organizations had solid links with local lawyers, that could be really important.
Mm-hmm. Right, can I just come in on the issue of lawyers? Agree with all that. Local counsel, absolutely critical. Another worrying trend, of course, is the targeting of local lawyers, such that there are certain countries where it's very difficult to find competent counsel, because if they don't go after competent counsel, they'll go after their families and so on and so forth. And there are plenty of states where lawyers are being investigated really because they're representing a certain journalist or human rights defender. I think we've got to speak about that openly, and we have to deal with that also as a concerning trend.
It's certainly a matter of the safety not only of journalists, but of the lawyers and other supporters, as the wider legal framework is being used to cripple that press freedom. I have a few other questions here from the audience. So how can we address journalism's funding crisis and ensure that news outlets have the necessary resources to be able to provide legal support to their journalists? Who would like to take that?
Well, I think one area where, which might help is greater transparency about how the states, governments, use their ad revenue. Many of them are major providers of revenue. I was in Hungary last year, and I saw how the Orbán administration has basically starved independent media from those resources, and it's the biggest sort of ad client in the country. So I think more transparency about where state, and also during COVID, there were special funds set up to help media in certain places, and it's very unclear how the funds were distributed in a number of countries. So that is one issue. Then there is the question of how much revenue is being siphoned off by the digital platforms, which have become the gateways to media now. So there are a whole range of issues here that need to be seen not just as economic questions for the market, but really as human rights issues, because they are creating what is being called media deserts. And the biggest sort of victims of media deserts are local media, local print media, radio, and so on. And that's what most people in communities still rely on that. So I think one needs to look at a kind of states, governments need to look at how the financial economy, how the economy is working, the media, political economy of the media sector is working.
Financial viability being really, being at threat as well. Yeah. Jill.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I mean, I think again, I hate to add complexity upon complexity to this issue, but what we're looking at in the information space right now is this sometimes it's called information chaos, or this kind of environment in which disinformation and lies and propaganda circulate freely. There are a lot of calls on government to regulate that space more effectively, and there are some efforts by government that are seeking to address this challenge responsibly. But let's also recognize that whenever you invite governments to take on this role of regulating the information space, there's a tremendous opportunity for abuse and for opportunistically exploiting that opportunity, and we're seeing that. And then also in the funding arena, there's also a big push, and I think with considerable justification, because we've discussed the financial challenges that media outlets face around the world. There's a crisis in funding from major philanthropies. Some are shifting their priorities. And so media organizations and institutions are looking to governments to somehow channel resources into the media space through tax structures or other kinds of structures. And so we're, at the same time that we're sitting here, talking about the way that governments are undermining the information space and attacking journalists and using this kind of lawfare. In a different context, we're calling on governments to regulate and even invest in and financially support journalists. And so that is an enormous challenge, and we need to make sure that the well-intentioned efforts to invite governments into this and help us solve this challenge aren't exploited by ill-intentioned governments to actually undermine and sort of disrupt the ability of journalists to carry out their responsibility in the public interest.
That actually is a nice segue into another question that we have around. It has disappeared now, but there was a question. Oh no, here it is. Is there a particular government you can think of who has sufficient legal provisions in place to protect journalists? What are governments doing that are positive developments in response to these threats, attacks, and overall very grim picture?
I will say it's getting worse.
That's our answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting worse. I mean, there's the First Amendment, there's lots of good law in the books, but I can't think of a place where it's getting better. So, but I do want to talk about slaps, right? There is a. I don't know if I'm stepping on your toes there. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I was going to say, I mean, we talk about bad news a lot. I do want to highlight, I mean, there is some in the 3 seconds that we have left. Some of the work that we've done as a panel has been telling states to do certain things through legislative reform, etc. I mean, some good news is that before the Russian invasion, we really focused on safe refuge. Certain states listened, they took steps, and as a result, there have been emergency visas used to protect Belarusian and Russian journalists, as well as other journalists, and to get them to safe havens. These are things that other states are doing, and they did before that need was required. I think the challenge is to get these on a firm and sort of institutional footing so that all journalists can apply for these sorts of mechanisms. But there are states that are working very hard in this area. The difficulty with states is to move them from words into action, especially when ministers, or in the case of the country we're in at the moment, prime ministers are changing so frequently. So sometimes it feels like Sisyphus. You make progress with one political bloc, and then you need to make the same arguments to a new political bloc.
And if I can add, there are lots of good practices out there, not only of states, but at the level of communities, among the media sector itself, and even on the digital side. And my report is full of those good practices. The issue is, how do we actually build the political will to scale up those small initiatives that are taking place? So that's where the real challenge is, building up political will and putting pressure on the private sector. Media companies, large media barons, are as much a threat to media freedom as dictatorships. So I think we need to look at the whole picture, and we need to encourage the good initiatives that have been taken, particularly at the community level, particularly with civil society, with community journalists and others, and scale them up.
On that note, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, John, Joel, Irene, Patrícia. Thank you all for your questions, and hopefully in answering one of the questions that was posed here about what's the call to action for the audience. There's obviously, as you can see, multiple threats from all directions that press freedom is facing. So there's a role for everybody, both in raising awareness, if you're a lawyer, and getting involved in providing that legal defense, if you're involved with civil society organizations, advocating for this change, if you're part of governments, listen up. There's quite a bit of work to do in terms of legislation and how you're implementing those laws. So there's a role for everyone to play, and just even simply letting people know and raising that appreciation and education around these challenges that press freedom and journalists are facing pretty much in every country around the globe is essential. So thank you again for joining us today.